Hi guys, how old are you? I'd love to see the age range of our viewers. Write your age below.
On my 35th birthday, in the middle of our usual Sunday family brunch, my mother handed my younger brother the keys to the family business wrapped up in a glossy legal packet, smiled at me with a look that somehow managed to be both condescending and casual, and said, "You're just not ready yet." I remember the sound of the butter knife clinking on my plate, the way Ethan's jaw tightened to hide his grin, and how my father's face, usually stoic during these moments, betrayed the briefest flicker of discomfort before he looked away. Nobody asked how I felt. No one even paused, as if this decision had been rehearsed without me. We were seated at the long farmhouse table in the dining room, the same one where I'd spent years helping host investor dinners, draft partnership memos, and prepare tax records late into the night while Ethan was still off chasing bad startup ideas and blowing Dad's money on flashy tech that never stuck. I had worked in every department of our manufacturing company since I was 19. Inventory, supply chain, even a grueling 3-month stint in payroll when we couldn't keep a manager on board. But in that moment, I became invisible. I watched Ethan, 2 years my junior, and still casually overdrawing his personal account each month, lean back in his chair like a newly crowned king, while my mother, dressed like she was on the board of something important, laid out the succession plan without so much as a glance in my direction. I didn't say a word, I didn't flinch. I didn't ask why or argue or cry. I picked up my fork, finished my bite of Eggs Benedict, dabbed my mouth with the linen napkin, and looked down at the cup of coffee in front of me that had gone cold without me noticing. The room was buzzing with congratulations, Ethan's girlfriend already peppering him with questions about his vision for the company, and I sat quietly, letting the rage burn in my chest without letting it show on my face, because I knew something they didn't know, or rather, I had something they had chosen to ignore. I had spent the last 18 months preparing an internal audit of our company's finances. Not for revenge, not at first anyway. I did it because I cared about the company's future, and because I had a hunch that something didn't add up. Ethan's sudden rise in meetings, my father's oddly timed silences, and the way my mother had started attending shareholder reviews, despite never having shown much interest before. So I had Clara, my old college roommate turned forensic accountant, help me dig, quietly, carefully. And what we found wasn't illegal, not technically, but it reeked of backroom deals and quietly shuffled documents, including a contract that placed Ethan in the CEO seat weeks before the official discussion ever took place. When brunch was over and everyone had filtered out into the backyard for mimosas and photos, I slipped upstairs to the guest bedroom and pulled a single manila envelope from my tote bag. It was thick enough to feel serious, but thin enough to pass as just another report. I pressed it flat, closed the bag again, and walked downstairs with the calm of someone who knew that revenge didn't have to be loud to be devastating. My father was in the living room alone, scrolling through his tablet, glasses perched low on his nose. I sat beside him, placed the envelope on the coffee table without a word, and leaned in. "Happy birthday to me," I said, just loud enough for him to hear. He looked at me, surprised at the envelope, but didn't reach for it. Not yet. I didn't stay to watch him open it. I stood up, kissed his cheek, and walked out the front door as the sound of laughter echoed from the backyard like it belonged to someone else's life. On the drive home, I didn't cry. I didn't even turn on the radio. I just thought about how strange it is that people will watch you build something for years, will rely on your work, your loyalty, your consistency, and then, with a smile and a few words, pretend you were never in the room. But I wasn't interested in being seen anymore. I was interested in being remembered. That night, as I sat on my couch with a glass of wine and the television turned low, my phone buzzed. It was Ethan, of course. His message was short and smug. "Hope there's no hard feelings." I smiled. My reply took only 2 words. "Congrats, sincerely." And I meant it, because congratulations are due when someone walks straight into a fire they think they can control. I closed the chat, opened my email, and attached a scanned copy of the audit page to a message titled, "For your review." I addressed it to my father, scheduled it for 6 a.m., and turned off the lights. What comes next isn't rage or revenge. It's the long, deliberate unraveling of a story everyone else thought was already written. The morning after my birthday was quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful, but instead carried the weight of unspoken tension. Like the hush before a storm that everyone senses but no one wants to acknowledge. And as the first light poured in through the sheer curtains of my living room, casting pale, sterile beams across the hardwood floor, I sat cross-legged in my robe, sipping coffee that had gone lukewarm. While my mind replayed the last 24 hours, with the mechanical precision of someone trying to memorize the exact moment, everything shifted from insult to opportunity. I had never imagined my birthday would become a milestone not of celebration, but of strategy. A day that, by all traditional standards, should have involved laughter and cake and champagne, instead marked the moment I stepped, albeit quietly, into a very different role in this family drama. I opened my laptop slowly, deliberately, the familiar creak of its hinge somehow grounding me as I typed in my password and pulled up the folder marked with the innocuous name Vendor Audits 2023, which in truth was a carefully curated collection of emails, contracts, and flagged inconsistencies I had accumulated over the past year and a half under the guise of updating our procurement process. What I had stumbled upon during what started as a passion project, aimed at streamlining inefficiencies, had quickly morphed into something far murkier, a spiderweb of unusually timed executive decisions, sudden fund reallocations, and a handful of internal memos, some signed by Ethan weeks before he was allegedly brought into official leadership discussions, suggesting that my parents, or at the very least my mother, had planned this handoff long before they felt brave enough to voice it out loud. The real centerpiece of the collection, the one that Clara had practically highlighted in metaphorical neon lights, was a scanned image of a document bearing 3 signatures, my father's, my mother's, and Ethan's, all dated 8 weeks prior to the family meeting where they presented Ethan's new role as if it had just been finalized. It wasn't fraud, not in the strictest legal sense, because they technically had the authority to enact those changes behind closed doors, but it was enough of a manipulation of timelines and truth that if shown to the right people, particularly the silent partners or even just the veteran board members who still remembered my role in the company's last expansion, it would raise eyebrows and possibly hack away at the confidence that was now resting so precariously on Ethan's freshly ironed shoulders. I printed one copy, just one, folded it neatly, and slipped it into a fresh manila envelope, the kind that had become almost symbolic in our family, since every major decision, every turning point in our business, had historically been delivered inside one. That's what made the gesture so poetic, really. I knew my father would recognize the implication before he even opened it. And that's what I wanted. Not a confrontation, not a shouting match, just a slow, quiet awakening to the reality that things weren't as neatly buttoned up as he believed. I wrote a short cover note on my personal stationery, which I hadn't touched in years. Thought this might interest you, M. Then carefully, I sealed the envelope, labeled it with his name in bold ink, and placed it back into my bag, not intending to drop it off at the office, not yet, but waiting for the right moment, because with people like my father, timing mattered more than content. When 6 o'clock the next morning rolled around, I was already dressed and sitting in front of my desktop computer, cursor hovering over the send button of an email addressed solely to him with the subject line, "For your review." I attached a PDF copy of the document, the same one in the envelope he had chosen not to open the day before, and as my finger clicked the mouse, sending it off into the digital abyss where it would surely land with the weight of a small bombshell, I leaned back in my chair and felt, for the first time in a long time, not victorious, but clear-minded. I wasn't aiming to destroy anyone. I was simply reasserting the truth into a narrative that had been hastily rewritten without my input. By mid-morning, my phone rang. It was my father's number, and I let it ring twice before answering with the kind of neutral tone I had perfected over years of being professional in meetings that demanded I stay composed while men around me talked over my ideas. He didn't greet me, no pleasantries, just one line, spoken low, like someone had punched the air out of him. "What is this?" I didn't ask what he meant. We both knew. "It's context," I said, something the new CEO probably didn't mention. There was a pause, not long, but weighted, like he was deciding whether to continue the conversation or hang up and pretend it never happened. But he didn't hang up. "Where did you get this?" "Does it matter?" I asked, and then softened my tone because I wasn't trying to corner him. I wanted him to see that I wasn't the enemy, just not the fool he'd hoped I'd continue being. "It's not about where. It's about why you never showed it to me, why no one even thought I might ask." He sighed, and in that breath I heard more than words could say. Regret, maybe, or just fatigue. "Can you come in this afternoon? I'll bring the original," I said. After we hung up, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything close to what I'd expected. No surge of justice, no sense of turning the tables. If anything, I felt the strange numbness of someone who realized that the battle wasn't won by being right. It was only just beginning. And as I slid the envelope back into my tote and grabbed my car keys, I knew one thing with complete certainty. Whatever my father saw in that document had rattled him, and the cracks that formed in his voice might just be the start of something bigger, something irreversible, something that even Ethan wouldn't see coming. The drive to my father's office that afternoon felt longer than usual, not because of traffic or any physical delay, but because with every mile I put between my condo and the downtown tower that bore our family's name, in muted gold lettering, the gravity of what I had set in motion settled deeper into my chest, tightening like a slow, deliberate knot that no amount of rationalizing could quite untie. I had grown up in that building, not in the literal sense, but in the thousand small ways that a child of business-minded parents does. Wandering the carpeted halls after school, sitting through meetings with headphones on, watching my father scribble notes on legal pads while muttering through financials, and later, much later, carving out a space for myself not because I was invited, but because I believed I had earned the right to be there. Now, as I parked on the executive level and walked past the polished receptionist, who gave me a polite but slightly confused smile, likely wondering why the CEO's sister was here unannounced, I could feel the shift, not in how others looked at me, but in how I now looked at them. When I reached my father's office, the door was slightly ajar, which was unusual for him. A man who believed in boundaries and had always treated closed doors as both literal and metaphorical statements of control. I knocked anyway, out of habit more than respect, and he waved me in without looking up from his desk, his eyes fixed on the printed document I had emailed him that morning, now lying open beside a cup of coffee that had clearly been forgotten. The room smelled faintly of his cologne, and the sharp tang of paper, scents that reminded me of childhood rides home in his car, where I'd sit silently beside him, not fully understanding his world, but desperate to be invited into it. He gestured to the chair across from him, the same one I'd sat in for performance reviews, quarterly debriefs, and that one memorable meeting when I was 24 and convinced him to shift 10% of our production to sustainable packaging, a decision that saved the company over $300,000 in vendor contracts the following year. Now, as I sat down, he closed the file slowly, folded his hands over it, and looked at me with a mix of weariness and something else I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger, not yet. "How long have you had this?" he asked, voice low and gravelly, like he'd been up all night reading between lines he hadn't known existed. "A while," I replied. "Long enough to know it wasn't an accident." He nodded slightly, absorbing the blow without flinching, though I noticed his jaw tighten just a fraction, a tell I remembered from board meetings when bad news had to be delivered delicately. Why bring it now? I paused, considered lying, but what was the point? Because you didn't think I'd notice, or maybe you did and hoped I wouldn't say anything. Either way, I wasn't going to let that brunch become the final word. He exhaled through his nose, leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, really looked at me, not as his daughter, not even as an employee, but as a threat. Or maybe something worse, a complication. "You're not wrong," he admitted finally, the words landing heavy between us. "But this isn't going to play out the way you think it is." Before I could ask what that meant, the door swung open without warning, and Ethan strode in like he owned the place, which, technically, he now did, wearing that smug, performative confidence he'd cultivated since high school, when getting away with things became easier than getting caught. He saw the envelope on the desk, the tension in the room, and his expression darkened in an instant. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, eyes narrowing as he picked up the document without waiting for permission. His face paled as he scanned the page, recognition flickering across his features like a mask being pulled off. "Where did you get this?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He turned to our father, voice rising. "You're actually taking this seriously?" "It's nothing. It's just paperwork. Some outdated draft, probably not even the final version." "Then why sign it?" I asked quietly, tilting my head. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. Because we were finalizing terms. It was exploratory, not binding. You don't understand how this works." "Oh, I do," I said, leaning forward, voice calm and precise. "I understand exactly how it works when people think you're not watching." Before Ethan could launch into another half-baked defense, my mother entered the office without knocking, her presence a sudden and unmistakable shift in energy that made everyone in the room straighten instinctively. She took one look at the document, at the expression on my father's face, and at the quiet fury simmering just beneath mine, and her eyes narrowed. "Is this about the promotion?" she asked, voice syrupy and controlled. "Mara, you're making this more personal than it needs to be. We had to make a decision that protected the company." "No," I said, still sitting. "You made a decision that protected Ethan, and then you lied about when and how you made it." She looked at my father, who didn't meet her gaze, and for a moment, something passed between them, guilt maybe, or panic. Then she turned back to me, lips pursed in that performative disappointment she used to get her way at charity fundraisers. "What do you want?" I stood finally, taking the envelope back into my hands. "I want you to understand that I'm not going to be written out of my own story." As I turned to leave, Ethan muttered under his breath, "You think this changes anything?" I paused at the doorway, glanced back, and gave him a look that was neither angry nor smug, just honest. "I think it already has." Behind me, my father said nothing, but I heard the faintest creak of his chair as he leaned forward, the beginning of a decision starting to form, quietly like the first crack in a dam. In the days that followed my quiet confrontation with my father and the not-so-quiet fallout that unfolded in his office, the atmosphere around the company, and even more unsettlingly around our family, began to shift in that subtle but unmistakable way that all significant ruptures do, not with immediate explosions or overt declarations of war, but rather through an insidious unraveling of routine, a creeping suspicion that what was once solid ground had now become something soft, untrustworthy, and liable to collapse under too much pressure. I returned to work like nothing had happened, wearing neutral-colored blouses and professional smiles, attending meetings with my usual efficiency and a freshly sharpened sense of purpose. And while no one openly acknowledged the document I had placed on my father's desk, or the accusations it carried, I noticed how conversations paused slightly when I entered the room, and how the younger members of the executive team, especially those who had once dismissed my presence as ornamental, began to offer more careful nods, longer glances, and the kind of measured respect that only comes when people sense that you might know more than you're letting on. Ethan, for his part, avoided me entirely at first, which wasn't particularly surprising given that his usual strategy when facing discomfort was to pretend it didn't exist until it either went away or someone else cleaned it up for him. But avoidance turned to aggression quickly, as it always did with him, And within a week, he was cornering me in parking lots, hallways, and once even outside the restroom, tossing out half-veiled threats in the guise of brotherly concern, insisting that I was misreading things and that I'd only make things harder for myself if I kept pushing. Each time, I smiled with just enough warmth to confuse him, replied with just enough ambiguity to make him wonder what else I might be holding, and walked away before he could regain control of the conversation. Because if there was one thing I had learned from years of watching my father navigate deals in boardrooms, it was that silence, when wielded strategically, could be far more powerful than shouting. What I hadn't fully anticipated, though I probably should have, was how quickly my mother would pivot from dismissive to strategic in her own right, orchestrating quiet little meetings behind closed doors, hosting dinner parties with key investors and board members under the guise of keeping up appearances. And, according to a friendly tip from a longtime assistant I had once gone out of my way to protect during a budget cut, floating concerns about my temperament, my aggressive tone, and whether or not I might be too emotional to handle any significant operational responsibility. It was classic, really, the way she wrapped her manipulations in honeyed language and plausible deniability, never directly accusing but always implying, seeding just enough doubt to create hesitation, and doing it all with the same graceful poise that had made her such an effective social strategist for my father over the years. I didn't respond, not publicly, not directly. Instead, I focused on deepening the quiet alliance I was beginning to sense among a few key figures on the board. Older men and women who had been around long enough to know what loyalty really looked like, who remembered the late nights I spent rebuilding supplier relationships after a massive client pulled out in 2016, and who had, on more than one occasion, quietly encouraged me to speak up more, take more space, even as my family continued to subtly discourage it. I met with two of them privately, not to air grievances or make accusations, but to ask pointed questions about risk, continuity, and succession. Questions that I knew would land differently now that they had seen my name attached to a document that raised serious doubts about the integrity of the handoff to Ethan. It was during one of these conversations that Margaret Hensley, a partner at the legal firm my father had used for decades, and a woman who had always treated me with the same blend of pragmatism and quiet encouragement she once reserved for junior associates, said something that stuck with me long after our meeting ended. She leaned forward, folding her hands carefully on the table between us, and said, "Just remember, Mara, sometimes the most powerful people in the room are the ones who never needed to raise their voice." It wasn't advice, not exactly, but a quiet affirmation of what I had already decided, that my strength wasn't going to come from outbursts or ultimatums, but from my ability to stay 2 steps ahead while everyone else played catch-up. Of course, just as things began to tilt slightly in my favor, just as I started to feel that maybe, just maybe, the tide was turning, something else surfaced, something unexpected, and it came in the form of a voicemail left on my office phone, delivered in a voice that was distorted, deliberate, and familiar enough to make my stomach turn with the uneasy recognition of someone who knew far too much. The message was brief, no more than 10 seconds, but its content was enough to stop me in my tracks. "You might want to take a look at your own timeline, Mara. Not everything is as clean as you think." I replayed it 3 times, then sat in silence, staring at the blinking red light on the receiver, wondering whether it was a bluff, a warning, or something more sinister. I didn't recognize the voice, at least not immediately, but the way it had been altered made that impossible to determine. What I did know, what became crystal clear in that moment, was that someone had decided I was dangerous enough to rattle, and they weren't above playing dirty to do it. That night, I drove back to the house I grew up in, not the condo I now lived in, but the old estate with the oak tree in the front yard and the stone fountain that never quite worked properly, and used the spare key I had kept all these years to let myself in. The house was empty, my parents out at some dinner or gala, and I moved through the rooms with the quiet confidence of someone who still remembered every creak in the floorboards, every hidden drawer and cabinet. I made my way to the home office, the one my father had used before he moved everything to corporate headquarters and began sifting through the dusty file cabinets and locked drawers with the kind of determination that only years of exclusion can cultivate. And that's when I found it, tucked behind a stack of annual reports and wrapped in a faded rubber band, a folder labeled in my father's handwriting. Mara, do not open. My heart hammered as I stared at it, my mind racing with possibilities. Was it a file on me, some secret clause in the will, something that proved I was never meant to be part of the business? Or was it something worse, something I had forgotten, ignored, or never known? My hand hovered over the flap for what felt like an eternity, the silence around me pressing in like a held breath, and then I pulled it open. But what I saw inside wasn't just shocking, it was destabilizing, because whatever truth I had uncovered in those documents I thought would shake them, what was in this folder had the power to destroy something far bigger. And in that moment, I knew the final move wouldn't be mine alone. It was now a question of who would blink first. In the hours that followed my discovery of the folder labeled Mara, do not open, I found myself suspended in a state of such surreal clarity that it felt less like I was moving through the world and more like I was observing it from behind glass, as if everything around me had dimmed slightly, sound dulled, light muted, and time itself slowed to make space for the weight of what I had just uncovered, a discovery so intricate and unexpected that even now, as I try to recall every detail, my thoughts feel like they're wrapped in gauze, sharp edges softened by the impossibility of it all. Because what lay within that folder was not a scandal in the traditional sense, not some shocking betrayal or criminal misdeed, but something far more insidious, a carefully constructed narrative about me, written not with malice but with quiet, chilling intent. It was a timeline, a detailed account of my actions, choices, and missteps from the last 2 decades, annotated with notes in my father's handwriting, some of them practical, some strategic, and a few that felt so deeply personal that they read less like business analysis and more like the dissection of a daughter who had been observed, cataloged, and ultimately deemed unfit. Pages of memos and emails printed out, scribbled with comments, notes on meetings I had attended, ideas I had pitched, and decisions I had made, some praised, others marked with a question mark, still others underlined in red with the word watch beside them. But the most damning revelation wasn't any single comment or criticism. It was the final document, dated 5 years ago, titled Succession Strategy, Contingency Option, which laid out 2 distinct pathways, one with Ethan as the heir, the other with me, contingent on stability, leadership composure, and public image reliability, as if my entire future had been reduced to a list of qualities my father had quietly decided I might never possess. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I sat there in the chair he used to sit in when I was a child, asking questions about how stocks worked and why some companies failed. And I felt something inside me harden, not into anger or bitterness, but into resolve, the kind of slow-burning clarity that only comes when someone you've spent your life trying to impress finally shows you who they really are. I left the folder exactly where I found it, careful not to disturb the order, not because I wanted to protect him, but because I wanted him to know that I had seen it, that I had read every line, and that I now understood the game better than I ever had before. The next evening, my family gathered again, this time not for brunch or celebrations, but for what my father called a clarifying discussion, the kind of phrasing he used when he needed to address something serious without admitting that it had spiraled beyond his control. We met in the formal dining room, the same one where birthdays and holidays had once brought us together under the illusion of harmony. And now it felt more like a negotiation chamber, everyone sitting at the long table with a cautious silence that only deepened when Margaret Hensley arrived unannounced, a folder in hand and an expression that betrayed nothing. She took her seat at the far end, beside my father, and unfolded the document slowly, methodically, like a surgeon preparing for a procedure. The air was thick with anticipation. Tension threaded through every glance and unspoken word. My mother sat straight-backed and poised, Ethan looked restless, and my father, ever the tactician, wore the mask of calm control he had perfected over years of managing boardroom crises. Margaret began to speak, her voice smooth and steady, outlining a proposal for estate restructuring and business succession that was, according to her, drafted with everyone's best interests in mind. But I saw it for what it was: damage control, hastily assembled and dressed up in legal jargon to disguise the fact that the trust in this room had already fractured beyond repair. When she slid a document across the table toward me, an amendment to the trust agreement, one that offered me a seat on the board, a minor share increase, and a long-term performance clause, I didn't flinch, didn't smile, didn't reach for it. I simply looked up, met my father's eyes, and said, "I accept the terms." My voice was calm, steady, and devoid of the satisfaction they might have expected, because this wasn't about victory anymore. This was about truth. And in that moment, I saw something flicker in my father's expression. Not relief, not approval, but something closer to fear, or maybe recognition. As if for the first time he understood that I wasn't the daughter he thought he had groomed or discarded, but something far more dangerous, the one who watched, waited, and never forgot. I stood, gathered my things, and walked out without another word, feeling the silence stretch behind me like a final curtain falling on a performance that had lasted far too long. Outside, the sky was dark, the air cool, and I stood beneath the old oak tree, phone in hand, and sent a single text to Clara. It's time. No context, no elaboration, just the next step in a strategy that had now shifted entirely. Back inside, I knew the folder still lay in my father's old office, untouched since I had reopened it, waiting like a sleeping dog that might one day wake up barking. I hadn't taken anything, hadn't made copies, hadn't needed to, because the most powerful leverage isn't the document itself. It's knowing what someone is willing to hide in order to keep it buried. And as I drove away, headlights cutting through the night, I realized that the ending I thought I was chasing, an apology, a reckoning, a clean slate, wasn't coming, and maybe it never would. But that was fine, because I didn't need their approval anymore. I didn't need their seat at the table. I had my own, and they knew it.